Welcome to episode 2 of Mastery, everybody. Thanks for coming back. Nick, hey.
How are you, Adam?
I'm good. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Listeners, I hope you're doing well as well.
We have a fun show. It's going to be a quick show for you today. We want to give you a little bit of personal information and an introduction to each of us. We mentioned our backgrounds yesterday on the show. I mentioned I'm an author and a speaker and a documentarian, but what I wanted to share with you was a little bit more about how I came to do this gig, this crazy business in the first place. So Nick, as you know, I graduated from the University of Northern Iowa. Mm-hmm. Go Panthers.
Go Panthers.
And when I graduated, I was a debt statistic. I had several thousand dollars in student loans. I had $8,000 in credit card debt. I was upside down on my car. My dog had just died at home. My girl had left me at school.
Oh, geez.
I mean, literally, it sounded like every Dierks Bentley song ever written.
What was the $8,000 of credit card debt?
You know, most of it was stuff that I either ate, drank, or wore. Okay. And I bet like probably 80% of it was spent at a place called Shag Nasty's.
Oh God! So, what is Shag Nasty's?
That was like the darkest, dankest, most thumpingest dance club you can imagine.
Okay.
In Northern Iowa, of all places. So imagine on a day like today, it's 20 below or something like that.
Yeah. And
people going out and dancing at Shag's, coming out sweaty into this weather. That's where I spent my money on the regular.
God.
And then I did leave with a pair of Chukka boots from J. Crew and a 27-inch television set.
There you go.
So that was part of the $8,000.
Got it. Okay.
Anyway, I met a woman my senior year in college who is now my wife, and she gave me some great advice. She said, Adam, get rid of your debt or I'm going to get rid of you.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Good advice.
And so we lived, shortly after we got married, we lived on one income. It happened to be hers because she was my sugar mama at the time.
I need one of those.
Good if you can find it. And she was making like $3,200 a month take-home pay, and I was making $2,800 a month. And her money went to pay for our mortgage and our utilities and our grocery bill, and my money went to blast away all of our debt every single month. And so for the first 2 years of our marriage, we lived on one income and paid off close to $45,000 or $50,000 worth of debt.
Oh, wow.
In those first 2 years. So that's kind of my story of how I got into loving money and the study of money. I met a dude, my very first real job, and he gave me some great advice. He said, Adam, you need to go read this book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki.
Love that book.
You've read it,
yeah.
Yes. And then, of course, right after that, I read The Cash Flow Quadrant, and then he told me to read The Richest Man in Babylon and The Wealthy Barber, and he gave me this whole list that now sit on my shelves up here. So anyway, that's my story, how I got to where I am today. What about you?
That's really cool. Well, before I go into my story, I think it's really interesting, especially for the listeners, that there really is a difference in perspective that makes this podcast interesting and unique. You know, I'm 26 years old, so when I graduated, I went to school up in the, when I say up, I'm currently in Des Moines, but when I say up in the Bay Area, this is when I used to live in California. I'm a proud Midwesterner. Woo!
I love it, man.
But I went to school in the Silicon Valley, and you know, there was a lot of tech innovation and a lot of you know, different lifestyle for sure. You know, I just recently graduated college, was in a 6-figure paying job in San Francisco. Rent was $4,300 a month for a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, you know, apartment in San Francisco. And you know, for me, I was recently graduated. I had $35,000 in student loans, but I had a grace period of 6 months. And so, you know, I didn't really know what I was doing with money. And I was like, oh, I've got 6 months. That's 6 months that I don't have to worry about it.
A lot of time.
And so for me, you know, I was living in San Francisco and really didn't like my job. And so I left San Francisco, moved back home to Los Angeles. And, you know, my income dropped. I ended up, well, first of all, I didn't have a job moving back, so it was kind of like a leap of faith. And I was also living at home, so there was no rent. However, I was in a relationship at that time, so, you know, the dating, or not dating, but going on dates, that increased. So I ended up racking up, I want to say close to $8,000 in student credit card debt.
Yeah. And
with no income. And I also did an audit of how much I was spending, and at one point I realized I was spending $455 a month get this, Adam,
Dude.
on coffee.
What?
On coffee. And I really love coffee. So I used to drink 7 to 8 cups of coffee a day. And these are the bougie kinds.
Yeah, this is a bougie
not
coffee.
Starbucks and it was blue bottle, Stumptown Roasters, like that type of coffee. And that's when I really realized, like, wow, there is a shift that needs to happen because it's not working. I was definitely running out of money and running out of my credit limit, and so had to do something about it.
Wow.
That's my story, and that's when I was like, okay, got to take care of this.
$455
a month on coffee. Yep.
So did you do the math on what that would be invested over time and how much?
Yeah, it made me cry. It was like $10.6 million at the end of either 35 or 40 years. Yeah, invested like 9%. Yeah.
Dang.
Yeah. I like coffee, but I don't like coffee that much. So now, and we'll get this in future podcast episodes around budgeting, but now I budget $100. So, from 455 to 100, I will take it.
Yeah. Well, $100 in coffee. What is that? That's a $5 coffee for 20 days during the month. So that's probably reasonable for most people, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Definitely.
Interestingly, on the budgeting front, I don't budget for coffee, but I don't really work with a budget. We'll talk about that on an upcoming podcast as well, how I do my finances in the household without having a budget.
Cool.
We have kind of a rough idea, but not a firm budget in terms of numbers.
Yeah.
But I got not a Nescafe. What is the thing called?
A Keurig.
Not a Keurig either. Nespresso.
Okay.
I got an espresso maker, and I love it because I can basically make a nice cappuccino or something for about 75 cents.
Oh, there you go.
With that thing.
That's awesome.
That changed my coffee buying habits intently. So one of the things I wanted to talk about on this show today, in terms of the personal information and introduction, I have a family of 5, so it's myself, my wife, and 3 kids. We kind of pride ourselves, Nick, on living on somewhere around $3,500 to $3,700 a month. And that's mortgage, that's 529 plans. We don't have car payments, don't really carry any debt, but that helps us. That's investments, that's everything, right? And one of the things I realize is that when people are living on less, when you can live on a smaller amount, that life gets bigger. And we've talked about this being a short form podcast. We try and keep these to a limited number of minutes. But I talk about that idea of building a bigger life, not a bigger lifestyle, on a long form podcast called the Build a Bigger Life podcast. And I think it's important to note in the context of this podcast that we do attempt to live on a more reduced budget. So we'll talk about how to do that over the course of the coming episodes.
Sure. Looking forward to it.
Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think, talking to your friend, like, my situation is, again, very, very different. I'm, single, 26 years old, recently moved to Des Moines.
Lucky
and
dog.
I'm living in a studio that's 357 square feet. And as I'm moving and filling this out, I realize there's still 150 square feet that I'm not using. And so, I quote unquote have to fill it, right, with a couch or whatever the case is. But to the conversation you were talking about, building a bigger life, not a bigger lifestyle.
Yes.
It's really looking at, one of the things that is important to me is minimalism, right? And really, when I am a minimalist, I can really maximize my life. And so really taking that approach as well. So I think this is very interesting.
It is. The perspective of age from the both of us, I think, will be a fun thing to kind of banter back and forth. Because I think 357 square feet is probably the size of my bedroom, right? or maybe my bathroom, I don't know.
Head and bath, yeah.
So it is interesting. You don't have to fill it. If I said, "Oh, I'm a minimalist too," what would you think?
And what, like in this?
Knowing that we're in this environment here in my home, and
you're a minimalist.
Yeah.
I would question what your definition of minimalism is.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. One of the reasons that we do this, and I wanted to share a quick horror story, and I think Nick probably has one as well in terms of clients he's worked with. I owned a mortgage company from 2007 to 2010, and at one point I was sitting down with a couple who they were in their probably mid to late 40s, maybe early 50s. They had $73,000 in credit card debt. And they had come in to attempt to refinance their home and pay off some of that debt. So I did the math, and I told them, listen, in good conscience, I can't encourage you to do this. You can't put money that's right now on this revolving credit line basically on a credit card and roll it up into your mortgage and re-amortize it for 30 years. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And then I asked them, if you don't mind my asking, how did it get to this point? And the woman had tears in her eyes at this point, and she looked at her husband and she looked at me and she said, well, I guess we're just guilty of loving our kids too much. Mm. And I said, well, help me understand, what do you mean by that? And she said, when my daughter was 2 months behind on her car, we got her caught up on her car payment. When my other daughter found out and she was a month behind on her house payment, we caught her up on her house payment. My son had some legal issues, we had to bail him out.
Right.
And what hit me was, this was a family that couldn't afford to do that in the first place, and yet was relying on credit card debt, basically convenience checks, to get their kids out of binds. And it broke my heart, because this, I have to imagine, is where a large percentage of the American populace is today. Is they're doing things that may not necessarily be serving them from a financial perspective or a life perspective. And it's part of the reason that we're doing the podcast and why we're sharing these videos on YouTube, and there'll be infinitely more content as time goes on.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, and you know what I took from that story, Adam, is that like you said, it's really looking at the you asked a question like, what had you get there, right? Which I think is a question a lot of people aren't asking. People are just looking to get a solution or a fix, right, versus really looking at the underlying behavior. My horror story goes a little like this. I was sitting across a client couple, and they were in their 70s, and I was responsible for running the Monte Carlo simulation. So worst case scenario, if inflation was super high, stock market dropped off, their spending increased by another $1,000 a month, etc. What would happen? And what the software was showing was that they would still have $7 million left in their bank account if all hell broke loose. Yeah. And for whatever reason, and by the way, this was enough for them, their children, and their grandchildren. But for whatever reason, wow, the wife was still unsettled. And so that's when I was like, okay, what's really going on here? And as we dug a little deeper, what we ended up discovering was that the money that they had was inherited from her mom. And so at that moment I realized, wow, there really is no dollar amount in your bank account that could really address or provide the peace of mind, knowing that you had lost money, right? And so for me, it really started to question, if there are couples in their 70s retired who have that much money, in the worst case scenario, yeah, and they're still unsatisfied or unfulfilled, then like you said, a large amount of the people and population in the US, let alone the world, are probably dealing with situations that are much more extreme than that. No doubt. So for me, it started the inquiry of what is people's relationship to money? What does it actually represent? And like you said, I think this podcast definitely is going to address those things. And I'm going to turn it back to Adam real quick, and we do have a question and a challenge that we want to leave you with. Yeah, we mentioned in the first episode, every single one of these we come with an intention, and the shows themselves are meant to be sort of short form, get you thinking about money. Here's what we want you to think about. Think about the relationship that you have with money and the decisions you're making around money. And we want to leave you with this question. Are your actions currently serving you? So no matter what you're doing with money on any given daily basis, are they serving you, or is it potentially detracting from the life that you ultimately want to live? On tomorrow's show, we'll talk about money, your money relationship as a person. And Nick's got some cool questions around that, and I think I have a pretty interesting answer. Awesome. So, I can't wait to hear about it. So join us tomorrow on the show. Thanks for hanging around with us on the Mastery Podcast. We'll see you tomorrow.